Everyone, welcome to another Continuing Conversations where we talk everything Star Trek Adventures and Captain's Log, of course. Now, I'm Michael Dismuke. I am one of the freelance writers for Star Trek Adventures RPG, in addition to being a blogger on Continuing Conversations, which is still holding its rank as the #1 fan site for Star Trek Adventures RPG. And of course, it's my pleasure and honor to have with me tonight, as usual, Jim Johnson.
Hey everybody, Jim Johnson. I'm the project manager and line editor for the Star Trek Adventures RPG and the Captain's Log RPG, solo RPG, published by Midfield Entertainment. Love these many years, and super excited to be on the show here tonight with Michael, co-hosting this thing for. Still got plenty of stuff to talk about. So
91 episodes. 91 episodes.
91. All right, cool.
Wow.
Still going strong. We're working toward number 100. We'll try to come up with something cool to do for that. No idea what that's going to be yet, but we'll come up with something, I'm sure.
Well, once you guys hit 100, then like syndication is a lock at that point, and then you get the syndication residuals.
I'll sit back and wait for those residuals to roll in, right, Michael?
Exactly.
Yeah, just like Wham did the first 2 years of their albums.
Yeah. Are we Wham or are we Milli Vanilli? I don't
know. Ouch. They got paid the same, so it doesn't make a difference.
It depends on how much post-production you do.
Right.
I want to. Oh no, I can't say that about either of those artists. Never mind. I'm going into a dark place. I'm going to shut up.
Let's move on. Most of the cast of Starship Tempest, and looking forward to talking to you all again tonight. And why don't we start with introductions here? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can jump in.
I thought I heard something. My apologies. Brian, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Brian. I'm the GM and the kind of the head writer, whatnot of Starship Tempest. So I kind of run the whole crazy show, I guess.
And Travis.
I am Travis. I play Lieutenant Nick Holden, or Lieutenant Commander Nick Holden, on the show.
Mm-hmm. And Matt.
I'm Matt. I play Commander Conrad Smythe on the show.
Awesome. And Ryan.
I am Ryan Sheely. I play Captain Maddox for Starship Tempest. I'm also the lead sound designer for the show.
Right. For those of you who don't, I listen to the podcast. It's amazing. The engineering on it is quite an entertaining take on Star Trek Adventures. And you could always look back in our archives and you will see that we had them on a few months ago. We're missing Tara tonight. She's feeling under the weather. But it's a 5 crew group of friends, and the last interview went into their background and how they started Tempest, and so we consider them super fans and super artists involved with the show. So we're so happy you're back with us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
And tonight we're dealing with a very controversial subject, possibly. I don't know. It could be controversial, and we've never dealt with this before, Jim. And this was really about comparing and talking about Star Trek Adventures and Dungeons and Dragons. Why do you think this is a pretty good subject for us to go on tonight, Jim?
Boy, put me on the spot.
I'm totally putting it on you because I'll be honest, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons my entire life. Can you believe that? All the RPGs I've played.
And I didn't pick this topic, so yeah, but thanks for putting me on the spot here. I think it's challenging because like the general advice when you're doing a tabletop RPG is don't spend time comparing your RPG to Dungeons and Dragons. It's more important to talk about your game for what your game is and what it stands for and what's important about that game. Because if you just say, I mean, it's the same thing with fiction writing, right? If you're spending all your time comparing your fiction writing to Stephen King, then inevitably the reader's gonna be like, well, then why don't I just go read Stephen King? Or like, I'm not thinking about your book anymore. I'm thinking about Stephen King now. Now I'm going to go read a Stephen King book, and you've lost that reader, right? So it's always been tricky to talk about the game Star Trek Adventures with gamers, because like I mean obviously the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room is Dungeons and Dragons because it's been around forever. Everybody knows that it's the one of the most straightforward on-ramps into the hobby, right? I mean that's just where it is now because it's been around so long, and it's its own thing, right? It's its own kind of zeitgeist, and like there's Dungeons and Dragons, and then there's like literally everything else in the industry. So it's hard to really truly compare them. But I think because so many people as their entry level game, into the hobby, you got to give them some sort of baseline to say, okay, how does Star Trek Adventures compare to it? Is it similar mechanics? Is it as easy to play, et cetera, et cetera? So it's worth talking about, I think, but I just want to be cautious that we're not trying to compare the two, or this isn't a measuring contest to say which one's better or whatever, because that's completely subjective, right? They're very, very different games,
right? Where it came up,
subject matters.
Yeah, I think where it came up was because of the controversy last year with the open game license. And so people were flocking away from Dungeons and Dragons. And so what happened is people were like, well, what are my options? So I think this is more or less of a versus and more of a what other options are there out there for players. Yeah. Ryan.
Can you elaborate on that? I don't know what you're referring to.
Okay. So for years, it had it so someone could produce a Dungeons and Dragons game using the rule set and make money off it. They did Kickstarters and stuff like that. Later on, a large company, which I will mention because I don't get paid by them, Hasbro, took over Dungeons and Dragons. And so they did what big companies do, like ones that start with D and ones that start with A. And they started saying, if you make a certain amount of money, you can't produce. And so that they changed our open game license agreement, which created quite a bit of whiplash in the industry and had some people, as people do, say, I'll never play again. And so they started looking for other games. And Star Trek Adventures was one of the games that some people started trickling into.
That's right. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was very much a one of those situations where the big corporate brands tries to kind of screw down the ability to make money off of the property, right? And so there was, given kind of D&D's longer term history of being kind of more open in grassroots, a lot of people were up in arms about the changes that the big corporate overlord was trying to institute. And I don't actually remember how that all
I think they backed off.
Oh,
I think
they did. They did. Okay.
I think they were just like, never mind.
Okay.
So.
I think that they revised the license, and I only know this from listening to Eric Campbell's. That was my news source because he's really tuned into things like this. And I think they made it that if you make over $50,000 a year, then you have to report it, and that puts you into some sort of share agreement. I think. No one quote me on that. Sure. But they decided,
which would put you in like the 0.01% of anybody that could potentially apply to. So yeah.
Yeah. So I have to ask the group here, how many people here have played Dungeons and Dragons out of this group?
So I think Matt has done the most of us. I think we all have to varying degrees. But Matt probably the most, and maybe Ryan or myself the least.
I have played exactly once because my nephew is a big fan of our show, and he started getting into role playing. And so he launched his own Dungeons and Dragons campaign just to include Tara and myself when we were visiting him in Arizona. And so that was my one introduction into Dungeons and Dragons. And my oldest nephew, who at the time was 17, also played, and he was chaotic evil, and nobody could get anything done. So
there's always one of them. So maybe we can go in alphabetical order then. Let's go in alphabetical order. And what would entice somebody who is a longtime gamer, with D&D, to come over to something like Star Trek Adventures? What would those nuances be? Maybe we can go in and include yourself in it, Jim, in this alphabetical order.
I guess that's me then. Right, B.
Yes, your name starts with a B.
Correct. I think what's so interesting about Star Trek as a role-playing game medium is the aspect of just tougher, dramatic questions, and not, dramatic questions and situations and like the philosophical dilemma or ethical dilemmas, those sort of storytelling tropes that are not necessarily quite so clear cut as they are in kind of more traditional high fantasy, right? So like Lord of the Rings is, Sauron is evil and take the evil thing to the evil place and to get rid of the evil, right? It's very, very straightforward, whereas Star Trek, at least in its better moments, can be, or in its more complex moments, can be like, well, what is the right thing to do in this situation? Lesser of two evils, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what is really enticing to me about role-playing games in general is the storytelling aspect, and being able to like create these situations and then subject my friends to them of these tough questions, and like which path forward is really the best or the right path. And there's I just feel like Star Trek, as given its history, given the ground it has grown up out of over the past 50 plus years, is really kind of geared towards that, in a way that, like, certainly there's the potential in D&D for that, but it's not quite as like baked into the skeleton as it is with Star Trek.
Yeah, makes Star Trek sound a little bit more reflective of real life. Like, how do you know what evil is just off first impressions, right?
Yeah.
Evil doesn't always look like an orc. So,
right, exactly.
All right, Matt, what about you?
So to me, the real pull of Star Trek Adventures versus D&D is that it's.
Oh, and I went out of alphabetical order. I'm such an idiot.
Okay.
we didn't notice.
Me learned it real good, and me write for Star Trek Adventures. Thanks, Jim, for job.
Oh no. But no, the pull of it is compared to D&D. D&D is very much like you go here, you fight these things, you roll the dice. If the dice say you hit them, and yay, everyone's happy. 99% of the time, that's kind of D&D. Star Trek Adventures is much, much more story and character driven at its core. Baked into, like Brian was saying, baked into Star Trek Adventures is, yeah, you roll dice to do stuff, but you can always talk your way around stuff. If you can figure out some ridiculous techno babble way to do something, yeah, you do it. It's just like in the show, and it's less about fighting your way to the end of something and much more about solving the problem, not by just hitting things with something sharp.
Yeah,
most
creative
of the
solutions.
time. Yeah. Sometimes it is that.
Sometimes
but,
with some gushers.
Just like in the Star Trek episode, sometimes the solution is to pull out your phaser and start shooting. But
exactly, yeah. But
someone said the other day, I forget, Jim, I don't know if it's in one of our shows, but they were saying that out of like all the modules, like 90% of the time, they never even had to fire a phaser or something. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but someone said that in years of playing, they never had to, or rarely ever had to do that out of all these modules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's my kind of.
Let's go back to Jim.
So if I remember your question, Michael, it was why would somebody switch from go from D&D to try out Star Trek Adventures? And that's such a hard question to answer, right? Because it's so subjective. But I'll give it a shot. And only speaking from my experience, and like I could spend half an hour here just caveating this to the end of time to say like I have played a lot of D&D in my time. I really liked 4th edition. I seem to be an outlier on that. I know a lot of people on the internet zeitgeist hated 4th edition for whatever reason, but it's the game that got me back into role-playing games, 10, 15 years ago, whatever, because it was so fun and it was so different. And just the way the flavor text was set up and the powers were set up, it gave my players and I an opportunity to actually put some role-playing into the combat. Because I think with the we discovered that as we were playing the game, like we'd be doing great role-playing when we were outside of combat, right? We'd be doing the skill checks and we'd get into the role playing and we'd be doing really cool stuff. But like the moment we would get into a combat encounter, like all of our brains immediately switched to tactical board game mode, and the miniatures came out and the maps came out and the tiles came out, and all of a sudden all the role playing completely went away, and we were just like, okay, here's what my character is doing, and now I've got to wait 20 minutes to find out what the next character is doing, and it turned into this very step by step bashing away at things, knocking down the HP, and then inevitably, because like character or I guess player mentality that we would ever like run away from a fight or like just knock somebody unconscious. It was like, no, we're gonna kill every single thing on this board because the game master put it there. And then as soon as that combat was done, we would all of us we take a quick snack break or something, but we'd immediately switch back into role playing mode. And for the longest time, it really confused me. It's like, why are we playing two completely different games with the same characters? It was really cognitively messing me up. And then then we moved on to other things. But I think if there are players out there who have been playing that kind of game, and maybe they just don't know that there are other games out there. Maybe they happen to like Star Trek and they want to try something different and say, oh well, there's a Star Trek D&D, because I've heard it called that plenty of times, right? D&D is so commonplace now that it's almost become like the Kleenex of the RPG industry, where you don't reach for a tissue, you reach for a Kleenex. And now you're playing D&D, and now there's a Star Trek D&D, and there's a Marvel D&D, and there's whatever vampire D&D. So for good or ill, Wizards of the Coast, that's what you've got a brand name that is synonymous with the hobby, right? I don't know if that's good or ill, but
Oh, now you gave me a personal goal where people in the future say they have a D&D that's like Star Trek Adventures. That now you've now just set a bar for me.
I don't know. I would rather they just play Star Trek, right? But anyway, so I guess what I would turn the question or my answer around a little bit and say, look, if you play D&D and you've enjoyed it, but you're ready to try something different, like almost 180 degrees different than D&D, check out Star Trek. Especially if you've watched a few episodes, you're familiar with the series, you're familiar with the franchise, you have a sense of what Star Trek is and what it's about. It's about characters working together, doing dramatic stuff in a television format, because it's television, so it's scenes, it's encounters, it's beats, it's snappy dialogue, it's getting into the flow of storytelling, collaborative storytelling, in a way that the mechanics can completely get out of your way, and you can spend entire sessions not even touching the dice. And I know a lot of gamers don't like that, right? Because you want to get together with friends, knock some dice down on the table, and that's totally fine, right? But I think other games can do things differently, and I think Star Trek, especially with the pandemic and seeing how many people play this thing online. I know we've talked about it a lot, Michael, where this could almost be like your own radio drama every week or every session or every time you get together. You can
for the Starship Tempest crew, it is
exactly, yeah.
That's very much the kind of way, at least that I approach it. Is I'm always trying to how can I tell the best how can I make the best episode of Star Trek that I can personally make? And then how can I set them up so that they can ruin it in a funny way?
And then if I was going to be, I'll finish up just by saying, if I was going to be a little, I would say that D&D, even in its core, right, is still a very late 70s, early 80s kind of game, right? It's got that kind of structure to it. And Star Trek Star Trek Adventures is not necessarily the cutting edge modern game, but it's much more narrative. It's much more loose in terms of combat. It's more zones. It's more abstract in a lot of respects. So it just depends on what you want to play, really. I hate to punt on that, Michael, but it's just
no. I wouldn't expect you. I'm trying. I want people to know what to expect. Ryan, what about you? What's your?
Well, again, I have such a limited experience with Dungeons and Dragons that this truly Star Trek Adventures is my first foray into role playing, and that is largely Brian's fault. But also, if I was
role playing game wise, you're an actor.
Oh, yes, that's fair. But if I had never played Star Trek Adventures and somebody said, "Oh, you need to start playing, you need to pick up a role-playing game. You need to do this." And I would go to a store and I would automatically be drawn to Star Trek Adventures just because of the chevron, because that's where my love is Star Trek. I prefer Star Trek over fantasy, and I don't know much about Dungeons and Dragons to begin with. I would certainly recognize the name, kind of like we've all hinted at. It's the Kleenex of role-playing games, but I would have gone to Star Trek Adventures, I think, naturally. Having played the one time, I just prefer the more cerebral approach and the way that you can talk your way, kind of like Matt was saying, techno babble your way out of a situation, as long as you can put enough credence behind your argument and make a logical enough case on for the point that you're making, and the GM will be like, yeah, actually I didn't think about that, but that's awesome, let's do that. And I'm not sure how much of that happens in Dungeons and Dragons because I played so little, but that is certainly something that is definitely appealing. And to Jim's point, there are times when we're editing, we have one of our edit tracks is just roll sound effects, and there are episodes that go like almost our entire mission has absolutely no rolling whatsoever. It's entirely character driven, discussion based dialogue and characters. I put that in the win column for Star Trek Adventures, because I think anytime that you can have a really good, immersive, creative storytelling technique that doesn't require you to need to rely on the game mechanics for it to be successful, I think is, to me, that's a home run. That's a win right there.
Got it. And Travis, what's your experience been?
So I've done more things than not D&D. I think I've done 2 short things with D&D, and then I've done a couple in Fate and Exalted, a homebrew here and there, and way more in Star Trek Adventures just because of the longevity of the amount that we have played here. I would go even more basic in terms of the reason for it, particularly when it comes to the idea of going from D&D to Star Trek Adventures. I think the really simple answer is, for me, fantasy is not really my jam. I like the Lords of the Rings movies, but fantasy is not my jam, so I'm not super attached to them. That particular setting is just not something that connects with me personally. But D&D is the 900-pound gorilla in the room. So if you want to get into tabletop role playing, your chances of finding a game are way better if you're doing D&D. More people know it and can show you how to do it. It's easier to get a group together. This has changed a bit, maybe in the last decade, right? Since a lot of stuff has moved online in a way that it hadn't before, and more independent games and new games have come out and flourished. But up until more recently in history, if you wanted to try it, D&D was probably the one that was going to get you into it. And if fantasy is not really your jam, you may be like, this is kind of fun, but I'm not really into fighting ogres, and I don't want to be a barbarian. And there's just now so many choices out there that the setting is just something. It's something as basic as, I like science fiction, and so even if I had started in D&D, or if someone started in D&D and has done a couple games and they got a kick out of it but didn't really connect super hard, but they really love science fiction, now there are options. Star Trek Adventures, if you happen to be in that type of science fiction, there's cyberpunk stuff going on, there's steampunk stuff going on, there's ghost stuff happening. So moving to Star Trek Adventures for me is just a matter of like, maybe D&D is the way you got you started simply because it was the easiest on ramp to get into the hobby. But if you just like Star Trek, if you just like science fiction as a genre a little more, now there are options out there, and this is just a really good one that I happen to really like. That it's an easy way to go, okay, I've done this, I like it, but how about this Star Trek-y one? That's cool. And just the setting wise is a good way to jump over. If it's just a thing you like more, there are now options for you.
Yes, and all those settings you mentioned, all those kind of variations, wouldn't you all agree? I want your take. Can't you play all that in a Star Trek Adventures game? Fantasy,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like one of the great things about Star Trek as a franchise, and I think it shares this with other things like Doctor Who, is that first of all, the franchise is so vast and expansive, but any installment can basically be any genre. And if you look through the history of the Star Trek as a franchise, you've got like horror and courtroom drama and farce and just
period pieces.
Yeah, you can, and straight up like Die Hard style action, and you can take essentially any genre and couch it into the world of whatever of Star Trek or Doctor Who or whatever it is. And I think it's something that you can do in the world of D&D, but there's something about science fiction that I think just makes that more accessible or doable or practical.
Yeah, especially like we talked about it being a genre jumping type of franchise. That's exactly one of the limits that the writers of the original Star Trek worked with. It's like, well, what do we have access to today? We have access to
Let's make a Western.
Nazi memorabilia, Nazi costumes, because that's in the studio right now. So we'll pen a Nazi episode. We'll pen a Civil War. We'll have Abraham Lincoln show up for no damn reason on this show. And so yeah, it's perfectly. That was a really good point, Michael. That it's just rife to explore all those genres.
I was gonna say maybe not the ghosts because they don't do supernatural, but then I remember we have Beverly's Candle Ghost and we're covered. So.
I mean, there's an episode of Voyager that's literally called "The Haunting of Deck 12," right?
Yeah,
so
true.
Yeah,
you know,
And there's all kinds of Ghosts in the Machine episodes.
oh, absolutely,
Mhm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about it, because let's talk about how people could. I always like giving tools people can use. And Jim, you've talked about this. That's why I asked that question about how Star Trek encapsulates all these genres. If you wanted to bring over your group and say I want to do Star Trek Adventures, what would your tips be to say bring over a fantasy group into Star Trek Adventures? How could you entice them? What kind of games? I've seen some modules out there that are really good matches for it, but what would you all do to construct that? I love my questions when they end in deep silences.
I can dive in. Holodeck episode.
Yeah.
Always just put them in a holodeck episode where there's something more akin to what they're used to or interested in, and then sort of weave it into that. I mean, that's the way they get away with it a whole bunch of times in like.
And it's always a situation where they can't just turn it off. Like the holodeck is the most dangerous technology other than data on the show.
Yeah.
Which,
if you want to have a B movie episode, like go for it.
yeah, and you can just freeform it with your group, right? So if you're trying to entice your group and maybe they're a little hesitant, you can say, well, what have you guys always wanted to try, premise setting, whatever wise, that we've never had a chance to do, pitch it, and then you can basically build that into a holodeck premise,
or an alien world,
or the Shore Leave Planet from the original series. One thing I do, because it is a classic trope of Star Trek that the holodeck has gone crazy and now we can't turn it off without killing her, blah blah blah. I will say the one time that I think Star Trek subverts or averts that trope and still has a really good like episode with real stakes to it built around it is the one in Deep Space Nine where it's like Julian's friend has written him this casino program for him, but his friend put this Easter egg in it where they triggered it, and so basically in order to not lose their saved game progress, they have to solve the Easter egg that Julian's friend programmed into it. Like that to me is the one example of a Star Trek holodeck episode done well with real stakes that wasn't the safeties broke for some reason.
I can come up with more. I can come up with that. Well, I want to say first, and that was cool. They brought the James Bond genre into that too, which was great, proving that you can bring a spy into that. But the one with Voyager, when the Herodians took over the holodeck and created the World War II scenario, they made the whole ship into a holodeck. That was brilliant to me. That was one of my favorite holodeck episodes. And so they were fighting in World War II. Oh, I love Voyager 1, but that episode actually had me scared because Harry Kim was on his own. Remember, everybody else was in the holodeck, and that was where Harry Kim actually had a chance to shine for once, which not for once, but another time.
Promoted though
for 2 or 3 times.
So I almost wonder. I'm hearing like an undertone of you're a game master and you're kind of sick to death of running D&D all the time, and you want to get your group to try something different just once. Like how do you do it? And I think Star Trek just by its very nature of being by and large episodic really lends itself well to one shots or like really short 2 to 3 session games. I mean, or you could even do like a cinematic, like we're going to do 2 sessions like a movie, and for part 1, part 2, or something like that. So it's almost a good way to test the waters with your group, to say like let's try something. Like we've done D&D for, because we're talking about D&D, we've done D&D for however long. Let's try like I need as a game master, I need a mental break. I need to change up my creative juices, try something a little different. Will you folks please at least play one other game with me once, and then we'll go back to your D&D thing. And so like I mean specifically with Star Trek Adventures, I mean we've got hundreds of standalone adventures, mission briefs, stories, mini campaigns, whatever. I mean, there's no shortage of story out there that you can take advantage of. Plus, FASA, Decipher, Last Unicorn Games. There's hundreds and hundreds of pre-made modules / mission briefs / plot hooks, whatever you want to call it, that you don't necessarily need to put a whole lot of prep time and effort into dropping something on the table and then running with it, right? So maybe Star Trek Adventures does have an advantage in that we are 7 years old now, 7+ years. We got a ton of material that you can just drop on your game table and give people to try. We have plenty of pre-gen characters. So it's not a huge lift, honestly, to at least try the game out with your group and see what it is. And it's also an opportunity to scratch a different itch. Like we've all been talking about how D&D is by and large very, very much fantasy, like very much low fantasy. Although you can turn that dial a little bit. You can bring in Spelljammer and bring in some science fiction into your D&D. You can do Dark Sun and do a little bit of kind of like post-apocalyptic almost horror to some extent. So there's a lot of wiggle room in there. But if you want to really do something different and go from fantasy to science fiction, by and large, give it a try.
I have a question too, because sometimes, I don't know, Brian, Ryan, Matt, Travis, if you've heard us do our riff episodes before, but since I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, would it be possible to take your current Dungeons and Dragons story, completely everything that's happened, and that's maybe one of the first planets the Star Trek crew arrives at to interact with?
Oh, my brain went to the idea of like a GM who's chaotic evil and just in the middle of the session goes, and one of the NPCs says Arch. And all the players get super mad.
Wait, no, but hold on. Let's stop for a second here. I'm coming in with the module, Jim. What if there's a module that says it starts with Arch, and then you find out that everybody was so consumed into this program that they're kind of waking up out of it, and that's the design of the module. But they're waking up into a crisis.
So I for our original missions, I'll write them up as modules, and they're like a reward for our Patreons. And in the process of writing one of them for one of our first season missions, I came up with this idea that I now would love to actually do, but it would require this sort of like D&D lead-in aspect. So the mission, the premise is there's this big Ark ship that's floating out in space, and then the Star Trek crew comes and investigates, and inside, it's like that episode of The Orville where there's a society inside, but they've forgotten that they live inside a giant spaceship, and it's kind of like a medieval society, but constructed within this habitat. And in the module that I created, like there's a memory erasing machine that the people think they have to sacrifice somebody to every day, right? So they periodically are like erasing people's memories in this society as a result. And so when I was writing the module for it, I had this idea of like, what if you started a campaign with a group that thought it was playing like a traditional D&D world, but they're actually in this Ark ship, and they're actually a Starfleet crew, but they've had their memories erased. And so they gradually they're like, wait a second, this fantasy world doesn't make sense, and it only seems to go up to there, and then it ends. And I never, that thought had never occurred to me until I was writing up the module, and now it's like ever since having done that, it's stuck in my head, and I'm dying to scratch that itch. Exactly.
Truman Show, the tabletop RPG.
Essentially, yeah.
And there's so many Star Trek. Actually, again, I'm going to say Star Trek's already done it with crossover comics. Transformers, X-Men, Han Solo, Doctor Who. They've crossed over and done these kind of things before. So again, Star Trek kind of Batman. They even had a crossover with Batman. They've done this already.
Comics are weird, man.
I know.
I love it. I love it.
They're wild.
Well, that's why we all grew up like, who would win, Hulk versus Superman? It's our personality. So Star Trek versus X-Men, But I'm looking for solutions to help people. I'm always like, try something once. If you never try something once, give it a try, right? And just curious how people would take to that.
Yeah, I would say. Because one of our, we were determined to get this show up and running when we first started. But Brian, you were a first-time GM, correct?
Correct.
And we had no less than 3 first-time role-playing participants under the first-time GM's direction. So like I feel like it would be best if the GM was somebody who was experienced in it, because when we first got out the gates, we stumbled so hard and so fast that we ended up aborting our mission after like an hour because we couldn't. We're like, we got to study. We have to go put some think into this a little bit. So I think having the lead be a little bit more experienced in Star Trek Adventures would be ideal. But if you're a seasoned GM for Dungeons and Dragons, I imagine you could pick up Star Trek Adventures really quickly.
Yeah, I think paring down, especially if you're just trying, let's say, a one shot or something, paring down the complexity of it. We joke on the show regularly about ship combat and how it's super complicated, and that's because the first couple times we did it, we didn't know what we were doing, and it was a mess. So now we have sheets made out, so it's a little easier for us. But Star Trek Adventures has a lot of different avenues. There's a lot of moving parts depending on the actions that you're taking. And I feel like if you're trying to get someone new into it, making sure that the mission that you're running is very straightforward, not necessarily straightforward, but very like, you're not trying to have them utilize every aspect of Star Trek Adventures, the game, in their first time doing it. You can probably be more complicated the more experienced your players are and the more experienced the GM is. But if it's someone who is new to it or has only played D&D before and has never tried, what's the terminology for the you're taking the lowest number versus the highest number?
Oh,
I don't know what the terminology is.
The golf-like thing.
Yeah.
That's not the technical
Your
term.
task roll.
Like you're trying to roll low instead of roll high. And so like if you've only played if you only play a little D&D and maybe D&D isn't really, grabbing your attention, but you might be interested in Star Trek and you're like, well, let's try this. Making sure you're kind of picking something where you only have to learn a handful of the mechanics at a time to give it a shot to see how you enjoy sort of the flavor of it, because I think the selling point, particularly of Star Trek Adventures, is the flavor, is the tone, is the, like we've talked about, the collaborative storytelling outside of just getting in a big battle and shooting fireballs at people.
Right.
So
target number.
Yeah, target number. Yes.
Number.
But yeah, so introducing it in a way that's like, okay, you get into it and you see what this world is about, what this like. How this sort of collaborative storytelling is being built within it is I think it's a really great hook. And so getting people into it is great. And I think that's the way to do it, is to sort of simplify out, okay, well, we're only going to be on the ships. So as long as you understand kind of how ship combat's going to work, we can go explore and do sensor scans and talk over the comms, and that'll be it. Or if they don't want to do that, okay, we're going to have one away mission and we're not going to do both type of thing. I think that's a really good way of introducing people to the system, that they don't have to try and learn all the different parts of it at once.
For those of you who played it here, is Star Trek Adventures really any more or less complicated than D&D? I mean, when I see D&D from afar, when I'm watching people play it at a game store, there's 22 different types of dice, and there's these extensive spreadsheet with the minus this under this condition plus this. So is it, or is it just different? Is it more complicated or just?
I think it's more that it's less of a branch system, if that makes sense, right? So like,
there's less flow chart. Like,
in D&D, I feel like the flow chart is very kind of straightforward in terms of like, there's lots of plus ones and plus minuses, but those go, they branch pretty clearly. Where I think Star Trek Adventures has pieces that their relationship is a little bit more maybe either complex or not quite as self-evident right at first. All that being said, however, I will say that like the very core mechanics of Star Trek Adventures, I think, are very straightforward. And then one of the things I like about the rules of Star Trek Adventures is that you can take those pieces of complexity and add them in as you're comfortable, right? So like really to play Star Trek Adventures, all you really, really need is like the basics of rolling a task and momentum. And you can get by with just those two things. And then you can add in pieces of the other, all the other aspects as you feel comfortable doing so.
Even if you take 3 years to realize you're doing momentum completely backwards.
No, not that bad, but pretty close.
Yeah.
Matt, were you going to say something about it?
Yeah, pretty much what Brian said. So he stole my thunder yet again, Brian.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I did. So I've done, like I said, a couple different ones.
Now Travis is stealing Matt's thunder.
Were you going to keep going, Matt?
No, go ahead.
I think he's being sincere, but we're never fully sure.
we just don't know anymore.
I did a friend of mine created a homebrew version of Exalted, where we were doing rolls where like we were when we would start a battle, I would be rolling like 27 dice at once. So it's like we had like 10 dice and it was like roll 10 and then count them up and then roll the next 10 and then count them up and then roll more, because of just sort of the way some of those systems work. So like my experience has never been that those systems are super complicated, as long as you were able to just keep track of the numbers and it's just a matter of sort of following the numbers on those fronts. Whereas Star Trek Adventures was always like how do we handle crews on our ship? How are we handling, like, what can we do? Because again, it's not super rigid in the sense of these are your spells and that's what you can do. And now it's like, well, what can you make up and what technobabble can you make up to do something that maybe has never been done before in 2 years of playing this game? Sure, if you can come up with a reason and a way that makes sense within the world, go for it. And there might be some of that flexibility in D&D that I just haven't experienced personally. I haven't, like I said, I've only played, I think, like 1 or 2 games. So it's possible that that's there and I just haven't experienced it personally, but that was something that I've noticed between that. The same thing was like with the Fate system. When I played Fate, it was very open-ended and like, if you can come up with something, try it. And that was just not my experience. And the couple of times I played D&D was, these are what you can do, pick what those you're going to do. And then you can still role play and have adventures with that, but it was still a little more like guided in that way.
I think D&D is more accessible for a person that's never played an RPG before. I think just because it's I mean, they've had 50 years to
Refine it.
really get things streamlined down and perfectly simple. And you roll your D20 and you add whatever modifier is listed on your sheet. That's what you get. And if it beats the number that the GM says, then you do the thing. And that's it. And you have, here's my list of things I can do, and that's all I can do. But like Travis was saying, with Star Trek Adventures, you can do anything that you can possibly imagine that could work. You don't have to say, oh, I have a phaser, so I'm going to shoot the guy. I'm going to shoot the guy with the phaser. It's like, no, I have what have I seen them do on Star Trek? I have a phaser. I'm going to set that thing to overload. I'm going to put it down. I'm going to run away. That's cool.
It's almost like it's almost like Star Trek's famous courtroom dramas play out every single time, where you, the player, are building your case against the GM to say, I want to do this in this scenario. This is why I think I can do it. These are all the reasons in this scenario why this works. What do you say, GM? And the GM has the power to say, yeah, that's awesome. Or no, go bark up a tree. So,
or they can roll on the new probability matrix available from Captain's Log and use that to determine how probable it is. And go ahead.
Well, you seem like I would, but I don't have a personal copy. But if somehow that were to change, I would think of, maybe I definitely.
It's really hard. You type in modifius.com.
And we are guests here, Brian.
But Tara's not here to tell me to be on my best behavior.
No, that's fair.
Jim, you've been wanting to say something. I've seen you unmute 3 times.
I just can't get a word in edgewise. No, it's I was gonna mention, I think most of you have covered it already, but I almost wonder if so I mean, like D&D, like I think Matt, you were the most recent one who said it, does what they do really, really well, right? They've gotten into a science now where it's like, okay, here's task resolution, and here's your skill list, right? Strength plus thing plus this, and there's your skill. Well, it's this plus this. It's very organized and very admittedly, like I haven't played much 5th edition, so no, it's more flexible than that. Sure, great. I don't know because I haven't played it, but maybe it's more flexible than what I think it is. But what I remember is that it was like your character sheet lays it all out for you. These skills use intelligence, these skills use strength, these skills use dexterity, so on and so forth. You're done. It's all there in your character sheet. You don't really have to think about it, right? And I don't mean to say that in a bad way. It's like it's there on your sheet. You roll the dice, you look at the number, you're done, right? And then, so if I was going to caution somebody to say, okay, you're coming from D&D and you're going to try Star Trek Adventures, be aware that Star Trek Adventures is so much more flexible, right? So if you're attempting a task, it could be control plus command, depending on your character. It could be daring plus command, or it could be daring plus security. You got 6 attributes, you got 6 disciplines. You can mix and match them however you want. And in fact, with a recent rule an optional rule we put in the player's guide, you could roll 2 attributes instead of an attribute and a discipline, right? So
really,
so super flexible. And I think, and plus you add on the flexibility of characters' values and the characters' focuses, right? Those are all like pretty much just whatever you can imagine, whatever you can make up. Like Matt, you were saying, literally anything you can imagine, you can do in Star Trek Adventures. And I think in a weird way, that's almost a barrier to some people, because either they just don't know the genre or they don't know the franchise, and they don't have that creative. Or not to be harsh, but some gamers are more creative than others, and that's okay. But like, just having been on social media for this game for 7 years now, it's fascinating to me how much a lot of gamers really want the stratified. Here's what I need to do. Here's what I need to do to accomplish this thing.
I have options A, B, and C, and the game is picking the correct one of A, B, and C.
Yeah, right. It's almost like D&D is giving you very specific tools, right? And Star Trek Adventures is just pushing the toolbox at you and saying, go build whatever the heck you want to build. Here's all the tools. and players are like, but I got too many tools. What do I do?
That actually makes me think of an additional thing that might be tied to why you might want to try Star Trek Adventures. It ties in the idea of, you mentioned not knowing what to do if you're not familiar with the IP. But there is sort of a benefit for the people who do like Star Trek, right? Like when you're trying to come up with something to do, if you are a Star Trek nerd and you've watched a bunch of Star Trek, you've sort of gotten the benefit the same way like someone who's played D&D a bunch knows what they could be doing without having to check every time. Someone who's watched a ton of Star Trek playing Star Trek Adventures, you've seen a bunch of scenarios play out in the show, in various shows, various iterations, various genres, like we've talked about. So you have a little bit of sort of built-in experience about what you might want to try that you may not have if you're trying some other game that's a setting that you've never like even seen before.
Yeah.
So that's just one of those things where it's like, it feels so grand because there's so many different things you could do. But for someone who's watched a bunch of Star Trek, at least you maybe have a little more of a sense. It's almost like sort of a built-in experience that you wouldn't normally have trying a new game. Which a lot of games you don't get that with. So
I wish Tara was here to speak to this point tonight, because she, one of her biggest anxieties coming to join our show was, compared to Matt and Brian and Travis and myself, she has less intimate Star Trek knowledge at her disposal. She's not a memory alpha encyclopedia like most of us are. So she was very hesitant to participate because she didn't feel like she could be in character to the same extent that the rest of us are, which was incorrect for her.
She's the best person for being in character. So.
But B also, she has so many other skill sets and fan base. She's interested in so many other fandoms, including mysteries, and so she's very quick on her feet to solve a mystery. And in the couple of mystery episodes that Brian's put forward in our Star Trek Adventures campaign, she's been the one that it's like, stop talking Star Trek. Like, this is like, I know what this is. I know how to do this. And I think that because of the freedom, I don't know if again, I haven't played D&D. I don't know if that freedom would be available to somebody in a D&D campaign versus Star Trek Adventures, but certainly in our Star Trek Adventures campaign, she had the freedom to think creatively outside the Star Trek box and outside the rule book to come up with solutions to help save the day for us, which she's done on a couple of occasions. So that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's really knowing your players and building the game. If you want to entice them over to Star Trek, have them try it, building a game that meets their needs. Where at first, like, this is Star Trek. Oh, but wait a second, I'm solving a murder mystery.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's basically those are the two big blank spots in the equation, right? It's like, are you coming to it because you're coming from the D&D world and you want to try a different role-playing game system, or are you coming to it because one or several of your players or your group are Star Trek fans and want to try to bring the experience of watching Star Trek into the experience of playing or interact or role playing Star Trek, right? So like I think depending on which one of those is the case for the particular group in question, it that goes a long way in guiding how kind of you take the rest of the process.
Yeah, I think that might be a matter of like you said, knowing your players and knowing their tendencies and knowing what kind of stories they like to tell. Like what kind of things excite them when they're playing D&D? Are they really getting into like the political drama of the kingdom that they're invading or that they're being invaded by or something? Or are they more into the heists, or are they more into just like are they really enjoying like the hex crawl exploration and like discovering new stuff gradually and just like going through the open sandbox and like discovering new stuff? Like maybe they're not playing Forgotten Realms or Eberron. Maybe they're just doing like the GM has come up with a homebrew setting or something, and they're just going to kind of discover it as they go. Like Star Trek, because it's been around for so long and we have so many series and so many books and comic books and video games, like and we've already talked about, you can do literally anything. Like you could like a game master who is familiar with Trek could probably very easily make a custom tailor-made campaign or mini campaign for their group and port them over from D&D into Star Trek, and it still hit all the marks, right? But just using a different game system. I'd love to hear about people who've done that, right? Just to say, my D&D players, they really like political intrigue and political drama. It's like, okay, well, maybe there's plenty of episodes that touch on that. I mean, look at a lot of the Picard episodes with or not Picard the series, but with Picard, especially with the Klingon Empire. I mean, some of those are so Shakespearean in tone, right? You could just drop right all that into the political intrigue and have fun with it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and if you look back at the the TOS episodes, they were straight in medieval times. They were totally having completely medieval battles. Even I think the one with Kirk, it was funny because I've been watching them, and the one where Kirk had to fight that big thug thing, he's protecting the woman, and then like 2 episodes later, Menagerie, it's the exact same building being used for it's like oh, you could totally do that. A question too about the feel people get between the two games. We've talked about this sometimes on this show, and I've been noticing, from all the different RPGs I've done before, and then coming into Star Trek, that when people are walking away from the games, they're getting a different feeling. And that could maybe entice some people to bridge over to a Star Trek episode because of its hopeful the structure of hope in the future. What do you all have to say about that? Maybe if GMs are listening in and say, okay, we've talked about this and the mechanics and blah, 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 and the type of story. But I think there's also something about what you walk away with from the game table generally when you're playing a Star Trek game. Not talking Klingon War campaign. I'm talking not if you're playing Klingons, you probably do get the D&D experience. But what about for the normal Starfleet crew? How does that differ between a D&D game?
Yeah, well, I think that can be, I think that can be analogous or basically equivalent to, if you think about the feeling you get when you come off of watching one genre of movie or TV show, right? So if somebody walking out of the D&D movie, the one that just came out a few months ago, is going to have if that movie did its job, I think that was a good movie. They're going to come out with a certain feeling, right? But somebody coming out of finishing watching the Drumhead episode of TNG, right, is going to have a different feeling. And that doesn't mean that either of them didn't succeed at what they were trying to do. It means that they were trying to do different things, right? And so, depending on the kind of story you're telling, that's ultimately it's about, did you kind of fulfill the promise of the story you set out to tell in the first place, right? And so that can be whatever. It can be the very kind of straightforward, feel good adventure of, the good guys won the day and they found the loot and they beat the bad guys, and you come out feeling, kind of pumped up at that. Or it could be, something that might be a little more heavier or nuanced or complex, where you're sort of, maybe you're coming out of it, you're like, I'm not sure how I feel about how all of that went down. Or I rewatched The Mist from 2007, I think, the other day, and like, that's a movie that definitely makes you feel things in the ending that are not great things to feel, but it sets out to make you feel a certain way, and it succeeds at that.
Yeah.
Even though it's not necessarily a good feeling that it's trying to engender in you, right? So I think at least in that regard, it's a pretty straightforward, like, what kind of story are you trying to tell? What kind of feeling are you trying to stir up in the person? In a movie or TV show, it's like it's in the audience member, it's whoever's watching it. But in a role-playing game, it's the players who are at your table. Like, what kind of feeling are you trying to stir up in your players? Is it that adventure, Indiana Jones, we beat the bad guys and found the treasure, or is it something something else? And then the question is just, can you actually pull it off or not?
Yeah, I would say that I have felt every emotion walking away from our campaign over the last couple of years. I felt exuberation. I felt defeat. I felt that Travis actually didn't like me, Ryan, the person anymore, because our characters got it, like, started headbutting each other a little bit. And particularly
like
that, yeah, that's fair. That night, like, particularly, I was like, wow, this game is really good, because it engendered in me. I was feeling my character long after we stopped playing, and that was like, wow, I did not expect to have that experience when Brian first said, hey, why don't we do this Star Trek role playing game? I was like, sure, it sounds fun. I didn't expect to feel my character beyond the limits of the game itself, and that, I don't know if that probably happens in D&D. I imagine it does for people who are passionate about it. I don't know, but it certainly succeed. That happened in me, and that is something that I feel is a special quality to have in a game.
So like I said, I've only done the I think 2 games. I think it's 2 of D&D. My impression of it, and this could be totally wrong, generally the end of a D&D campaign is either you are successful or you're not successful. And like sometimes you are successful but maybe feel a little bad about what you did. And those tend to be broad buckets of every ending that I've kind of seen play out. It's like you catch up to the big bad, you either beat them or you all die, or you're able to like slip out by the skin of your teeth and you made it out, and that feels good in its own right. Or you didn't succeed, or you got lost and the game just kind of meandered for whatever reason. Whereas it definitely feels like we've had multiple missions that we have played where there's no right answer, right? Like there's like it doesn't feel like there was a way to win or lose the scenario. It feels like it's just an experience that you kind of went through, and that informs you as a person, informs you as a character. And then that's how you get these sort of like complicated feelings afterwards, and you're like, oh, should I have done this differently? And you go, I don't know if that would have been better or worse, but then you're left wondering how that would have might played out, and like those sorts of things. Maybe that happens in more D&D, more complicated scenarios that I just never had a part of or have seen. But that's what it always kind of feels like. It's like you either win or you lose, or you maybe feel bad about what you did. And there's all sorts of nuances that happen with characters in between those things, but the sort of broad stroked outline of how that stuff happens. Whereas Star Trek Adventures feels very much like you can come in and be like, there was nothing we could do there, so we just did what we could do. But you're still second guessing yourself about what you might have done in a way that feels really nuanced and complicated emotionally, that I like.
Sounds to me like Star Trek Adventures explores the human condition, and maybe Dungeons and Dragons doesn't always do that. Maybe is that kind of
yeah. I mean, it obviously depends on the the story and the storyteller, the GM, and the people participating, right? Like I firmly believe that any story premise has whatever potential that you can imbue with it, right? So yeah, I think it just comes down to the kind of stories that you want to tell, and that your group, your players are willing to go with you on, like that, the journey that you're willing to go on. But definitely, like Star Trek as a franchise and Star Trek Adventures as a manifestation of that, I think just by the subject matter, just gets into territory of that can lead to a lot more complicated emotions and feelings. And like what Travis was saying, it was like, I don't know that there was a right answer to that. And
Right.
maybe it was this, but if I had done that, and then, really go ahead, Ryan.
No, yeah, I was just gonna say because that's exactly it. Because it's when I'm doing this with my fingers right now for everybody listening at home, I'm pointing to all the different players that we have on the screen. Where it's like my character's interpretation feels differently about that than Travis's character did. So it was like the ambiguity itself led to character drama that then took place between us and Tara's character. So it's that ambiguity that in and of itself leads to positive character development and character changing moments, like inflection points in the relationships of your characters. And it's super interesting that opportunity presents itself because of the moral ambiguities that are presented inherent in Star Trek. I love it.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of like the soil being a different, fertile in a different way for those kind of aspects, right? Because again, like going back to D&D is kind of built on the tropes of Lord of the Rings and that classical high fantasy, and those most of the time, and again, they don't have to, but just by the history of the genre involved, most of the time boil down to, well, the bad guy wants to rule the world, and that would be bad. So let's make that not happen. Versus, the kind of stories that you find in Star Trek and elsewhere, but like that are like, well, this entity, creature, life form is encountering some kind of problem, and what's the right thing to do? Like, what are its rights and entitlements compared to something, and the whole just, competing of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Do the ends justify the means? Yeah. Like, just more fertile soil for those kind of forces to come at each other, in which there isn't really any necessary right answer. Like, because I think, one of the great things about the Tempest and the characters that these guys have created is very much that do the ends justify the means question, right? And so Travis's character is very much like, yeah, well, ends absolutely justify the means, and if we got to do the dark thing every now and then to make it happen, then yes. And other characters like feel differently, and it's the show itself, by nature of being a role-playing game, being like a collaborative storytelling medium in which it's not just me sitting down and writing everything A to Z, or any one of us doing everything A to Z. It's all of us coming together and adding this piece and then adding that piece and adding that piece. It's, you can say, this character feels this way, and now this other character has an opportunity to rebut that. And then you can have a real ongoing conversation about those kind of more complex story ideas than just the bad guy wants to rule the world and we should stop that.
Yeah, so I wonder, I'm just wondering, like, do a bunch of Dungeons and Dragons people get together and talk about this level of Dungeons and Dragons? I don't know.
I'm sure they do.
I'm sure they have a podcast
out there.
Yeah. I'm just curious.
Matt, you played a lot of. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
No, I was just saying, I'm sure it's very much group specific. I think only in my limited experience, all the D&D games I've ever played, I don't think any of us, well, maybe one campaign, I think for the most part, we didn't really think about the game. We didn't really talk about the game outside of the game sessions, right? It wasn't like the stories didn't linger, the character actions didn't linger, and that's fine, right? I mean, it just depends on what you want out of your game. But I think like all of my best role-playing experiences have always come from a Star Trek game of some sort, and I've been playing for 30 odd years, right? Whether it was a homebrew or one of the established game systems, somehow my players and I and my other GMs and whatever, it was always like what Michael was saying earlier, exploring the human condition, putting these moral dilemmas together. Sometimes there's not a right answer. Sometimes you just have to pick the best of the worst situation. Like you get two horrible choices and you got to pick the one that's least horrible. But like, how do you do that, right? Like 1 million people are going to die if you choose option A, and only 100,000 people are going to die if you choose option B. Well, I mean, it's still, they both suck, right? So, and I think like Deep Space Nine did a great job with a lot of their episodes where you watch the episode and it didn't have the happy ending like in the original series. It didn't have the, almost laugh track at the very, very end where they all kind of like warp off and they're ready for their next adventure. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. That was like racism in your face kind of episode. And there was no happy solution to that. It was like, wow, you really have to reflect on that and think about it. And certainly some game groups are not going to want to go to that level in their games, but some might be willing to do that. So anyway, that being said, Travis, I wanted to touch on one thing you were saying, and I almost wonder if there's an element of like what kind of reward your group can expect to get out of the game. Like D&D has very specific rewards, right? You're getting loot, you're getting magic items, you're getting potions, and you're also getting experience points. Now I don't know what 5th edition has done to change up like how you improve your character, but like all of my experience with D&D, it's always been you're looking for experience points in order to get to the next level. Like it's a very level based, very systematic process, just like any video game that I'm sure most of us have played. That's the carrot, right? You're doing stuff in the game to level up. And in Star Trek, like Star Trek Adventures, I mean, sure, there's milestones you can reach, but like if by and large your character doesn't really improve session to session and episode, they'll change, right? That you can change their attributes, you can change their values, you can swap out their focuses and their talents. So they are going to change as a result of all the things that are happening to them in the game. But are they necessarily leveling up? Not really. And I think some gamers probably look at that and go like, well, then why would I play? What's the reward in playing? And that's the question I would ask them is like, well, what is the reward in playing? Why do you play a game? Why do you play D&D? Is it to level up and get that achievement? Or is there something deeper? And I think some folks have discovered that playing Star Trek Adventures, there is a deeper reward possible from playing a game. And I was just curious if anyone had a perspective on that. I've heard little bits and pieces of it around the screen, so to speak. But any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, our group specifically, we're a bunch of storytellers. I mean, they're actors, filmmakers, theater folk. Like we just love to tell stories, and so the act of sort of telling the story together, I think we would enjoy without putting it into a podcast. But we really love the act of like the sort of collaborative art of creating a story together in this way feels very good and feels very rewarding. When we've talked about it, like we get experience points sparingly as we play. And they've built up over time. But we sort of agreed fairly early on that it wasn't interesting for us to even spend experience points to like bump up an attribute here and there or something to try and get better. The stats are generally pretty good anyway. You have, you don't start with super low numbers that are tough to succeed. You generally start, you're a pretty competent crew. So we were like, rather than trying to min-max our stats, Brian allows us to spend XP on some items that we may want to try finagling around with and messing around with later, or particularly story beats. If we have something that we were like, oh, this episode, I would have loved to have tried this on this episode, as long as it doesn't necessarily mess with the mission as we played it, as long as it's like, a week later, my character rethought on this and really wanted to send this subspace message that he didn't send before, we can spend an experience point and do that. And so it's very much like our reward is the storytelling and the existing within that story and the fun that creates. And so the act of creation is a big thing for us. And yeah, just once we get into it and get sort of into our characters, the same reason I think we all enjoy theater and filmmaking and all of the different other art creation stuff is you put yourself into it and then you experience the creation of it, and that in of itself is fun. And then we also now get to edit it up and throw it up with sound effects and put it out for other people to listen to and enjoy, and that's its own reward as well in addition to that. But just sitting around, even if we weren't putting it out there, just the collaborative storytelling aspect of the creation of these stories and playing these stories out to see what they do just feels really fun and really good and engaging for me personally. And I feel like there's a lot of that within this particular group.
That's probably what I hear 99% of the time as to why people like Star Trek Adventures is because of the storytelling aspect. And I was talking to some friends about this the other day. We live in a time where a creative person, even with limited resources, can still get out there and put themselves out on some sort of medium, whether it's TikTok, YouTube, blogs, for the purpose of storytelling. And I know that Jim talks about it, and it's a goal he gives us as writers is to include in each book a little bit about how to be a writer. I don't know how many. I don't know how many other RPG books do that, where they're like, hey, since you're playing this game, let's also teach you how to get an end product that you're satisfied with, a way to journal and remember your memories. So that could be an enticement to games like Star Trek Adventures.
Yeah, I definitely think it's about, I mean, like everything that Travis said in terms of the storytelling, but I definitely think it's about the storytelling. Like if the thing you really derive joy from in a D&D campaign or session is the tactical squad combat of it, all power to you. You know, everybody has their own joys. But like if that's your love and you want to go more in that direction, I would say like do Warhammer, right? Try Warhammer or something that is specifically that of like squad tactical tabletop combat. If for you the really interesting thing is the story and the possibilities that come with different kinds of ways of telling stories, then I think Star Trek as a franchise and Star Trek Adventures as the expression of that franchise on the tabletop opens up just, pardon the pun, but opens up so many new worlds for you to explore, you know, metaphorically and literally, but like in that sense of just because of that flexibility. I think Jim, you used the word flexible earlier. Because of that flexibility in that system in terms of telling a story, there's just so much more you can do and further you can go in that story aspect of it.
Awesome.
Yeah. So for me, it is absolutely the reward of playing the game is worth it for me, because if there's somebody who's listening to this podcast who's a big Star Trek nerd and has never played an RPG, I'll just say that this is the reward. The reward is, for me, I get to play in my favorite sandbox, be an active participant in the story, make critical decisions that affect the course of our canon, our local canon for Starship Tempest. And I also don't know where it's going. So it's the best of both worlds for somebody who's a creator. Like Travis said, it's perfectly well articulated. Our group came together in a theater company in college. So we came together creating things. And so we are, as a player and not the GM, we are actively playing and creating, but we don't know where the story is going. So we're problem solving and finding our way in our favorite sandbox, which is Star Trek, but have both the creative power and the mystery in front of us. And it's just a beautiful combination.
Yeah. And getting to feel like you're in Star Trek a little bit, right? Like,
right.
That was like, there are moments there. They happen. It's not like every single time we play and every single one of us feels it all the time, but there are definitely moments where it's like, dude, I just feel like I was just a dude on a starship in Star Trek. Like even if it's just like you get into the role and you get into the scenario and it's like, oh, I have to make this transport happen or my friend is gonna die. And so you're rolling this dice to like try and do this emergency transport thing. And it's, you know, you've seen this 100 times on the show and then you got to live it. And if you're into the game and you're into the storytelling and you're feeling it, like you get to experience it in a way that you never do watching it on the screen, because you're the guy on the screen doing that thing. And that always, especially because you get to be the key characters, right? Like you're not, I was going to say you're not O'Brien, but he becomes a key character in DS9.
No, O'Brien is every journeyman's like dream.
But you get to be like the captain and do an awesome captain thing and fight a Gorn alone on a planet, or you get to, you know, be an ex-Section 31 officer and do clandestine operations. You get to be the doctor who saves the life of a teammate, you know, like all of these things that you watch and you root when you watch them do it. And like, if you're really into the game and you let yourself fall into it, that's you. And you don't just watch it happen, you get to feel and do it happen. It's awesome. It's a great feeling to be like, I'm in Star Trek now. It's great.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things I've really appreciated about playing Star Trek over the years, is that it's like just the way it's set up is so accessible, because you know the Federation is a gigantic organization. Starfleet is a gigantic organization. There are hundreds and hundreds of ships out there doing amazing things, mission after mission after mission. And it's not just about Picard. It's not just about Janeway. It's not just about Cisco. You know, like where I think of like, you know, Star Wars, I remember there was always a a feeling from a lot of gamers of like, well, what is there to do in the Star Wars setting, right? Luke has done all the big stuff. You know, there's Vader and there's, you know, Leia. Like they've done all the galaxy spanning big stuff. Like, how do you even fit into that? And it's like, sure, so I get that, but like in Star Trek, like your crew's adventures are every bit as valid as anything we've seen on screen. You can go do amazing, incredible things, and if you're inspired by what you see on screen, you know, that week on that episode, go do something even better, or go do something even more amazing that you're creating with your own group, and will have more meaning to you. So I think that's something that I've really appreciated over the years. You know, Picard does cool stuff and Janeway does cool stuff, but then like my captain's doing cool stuff too. And like in my brain, because we've collaboratively created that together, it has the same level of status, right? Or if not, maybe even more so, because it's something that we built and made with our own, you know, hands and our minds.
Yeah, the story is equal. We just all land in different mediums. Some people are fortunate enough to have got the movie and the TV show deal. Some comics, we do RPGs. So I want to give Matt kind of the final word as we're getting to our wrap up, because he's the one who has the most experience, it sounds like, with D&D and Star Trek Adventures, and he's been the quietest. So Matt, you get to get the wrap up statement, man.
Oh boy, this is fun. No, I mean, I guess I'll just say that, you know, I played a lot of D&D. I played a lot of other RPGs too, but playing D&D is super fun, especially if you have a good group of people. Finishing a campaign is great, and I've always done, you know, we finish a session or a campaign or a story, and yeah, that was cool. That was a really fun time. But I have never, in the middle of a D&D campaign or a session, like had to take a step back and go, oh, that's awesome. You know, where, you know, I mean, Star Trek is my favorite franchise of all time. And Brian does a really good job of every once in a while sprinkling in something that we all know. This random guy, he designed something. I don't want to give anything away, but there was an episode that just released, you know, it's the designer of a technology that everybody knows from Star Trek, the original films. Everybody knows this, and no one knows the guy's name that designed it. And we figured out, like, oh my God, it's the guy that designed it. It's awesome, you know. So it's this giant little nerd freak out because, like, oh my God, it's the guy that designed this. That's cool. And I honestly don't know if Brian made that guy up wholesale or if that's a legitimate thing he pulled out of Memory Alpha or what, but it made me so excited, you know, and I've never been that excited from D&D before any other RPG, you know. So that's what Star Trek Adventures can do. You know, I think it would be boring if, you know, every time we met, oh look, this is this is, you know, Spock is on your ship now this week, and Sulu's on the ship this week, and you know, it's just that would get boring. But Brian does a really good job. Just here's a little guy, here's a guy, here's this.
Once every now and then.
Yeah, and it's awesome.
Well, the universe is limitless. Most other genres are boxed in, and they have boxes of their worlds. And again, that's one thing I like about Star Trek is when I turn on Strange New Worlds every week, I don't know what genre I'm going to be in for that particular week. And that's part of the excitement of it, is they're taking me places no one's ever gone before, right? That's how we feel about that. All right, we've gone almost an hour and a half. This is amazing. I love it every time you all come on. And this is such an interesting subject. I mean, it really came out of left field. I know it was suggested, I think, by Tara, actually. I think she's the one who suggested it initially, which is why we put it up here.
I'm glad she wasn't here today.
I know. So let's go ahead and do our thank yous. As usual, we have our gratitude moment. You know, I'm going to go back, and I'm actually going to take it back to the old school. And I'm going to go ahead and thank Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. Even though I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, they definitely created a genre which is world changing. And for me, I can't imagine growing up if I didn't ever know about RPGs. That would have been, I mean, every other gaming system, you know, I'll play around video games and board games, but if that's all I had, I'd literally be bored. B-O-R-E-D. Okay. So let's give thanks to these artists who created this genre that has really become a tidal wave around the planet. That's my thank you for today. Let's go in alphabetical order, but we'll skip Jim like I did last time. We'll end with Jim because I like him closing out with gratitude. So Brian, why don't you take your gratitude?
Sure, I'll throw my gratitude this week at first the Writers Guilds and now the Screen Actors Guild in Africa. People who are striking. I live in Los Angeles. I work in the industry, but I'm not in either of those guilds. But as somebody who would very much like to be in one or both, and knowing how hot it is in Los Angeles at the moment, it's now past 8 p.m. and it's still 80 degrees out. My gratitude towards all of the people who are striking and spending many hot hours out on the sidewalks in front of all of the studios fighting for fair compensation.
Here.
Yeah. Right. Take it to Matt.
Oh, I guess my little moment of gratitude here will be towards Gene Roddenberry and all the other writers and creators of Star Trek for giving us this incredible world to play in. Because without it, I would be a very sad person, I think.
Or you might not know that you're sad, which is even worse.
Sad, yeah. There'd be something missing, something different. I wouldn't be able to put my finger on it.
You'd be doing something stupid like watching football or basketball.
Yeah. It'd be terrible.
All right, Ryan.
My gratitude goes out to Tara Jean, who could not be here tonight because she's recovering from a procedure and she's doing much better now. But one thing that she has been fantastic about is supporting artists on the internet. So she will use our Starship Tempest account to make connections and contacts with artists whose Star Trek art she greatly appreciates, and we greatly appreciate as a group, to try to get the artist's name out there just a little bit more. If we can be just a tiny little magnifying glass for an artist, we want to do that, and she does an amazing job doing it. And I wish she was here tonight, and she gives everybody her best. But thank you to Tara, and thank you for all those who support local artists, and always remember to cite the work that you are posting.
Here.
Good job, Travis and Jim.
So I think I will say gratitude towards the fans, not necessarily of Tempest, though them especially, because we love you all and can't believe you like us, but the fans of all the properties, but particularly Star Trek, because it keeps it going, right? Like the people who latched on and really loved it and kept it going, even in the darker times when it didn't seem like it was going to keep going. And all of those people that fuel the continued creation of that art and that continued thing. Just without it, it creates a sense of community that wouldn't exist otherwise. And it's this like fan community that just feels so good to be a part of a lot of the time. Sometimes it gets a little toxic, but most of the time, it's generally pretty good, and it feels very much like a community that feels fun to be a part of. And so thanks to all of them for continuing to be a part of that community, and for those that are being great about it, just glad to be a part of it. So, because we were fans first before we made this podcast. So,
and we were fans in the dark days of like between the end of Enterprise and the J.J. Abrams movie, like. That's when we all like really knew each other for the first time was those days when there was really no new Star Trek on the screens. Yeah.
All right, Jim.
Yeah, I want to. And this might sound self-serving, but honestly, seriously, I'm grateful to everybody on Starship Tempest and all of the other streamers and all the fans out there who are not just playing the game, right, but sharing your stories online, whether it's Twitch or YouTube or Discord or all the many other venues that are out there. The fact that you love the game and you love the franchise and you're sharing the world is so inspiring for me day in, day out. Because like I'll just drop in and I'll watch a video middle of the night when I'm tired of editing a document or something. I'll go find somebody who's doing something cool with Star Trek Adventures and I'll watch it and be inspired all over again. And know that like I'm putting in these hours because of that, because I want you guys to have fun with the stuff we're making, and I want other fans to be inspired by what you're doing and do it again, right? And do it again and just get into the storytelling of this beautiful franchise. And specifically because this episode was about D&D, right? D&D doesn't need the help, right? Like D&D has been around for a long time. It is so established. Like, you know, there's plenty of people playing Twitches and playing the game, which is great. But like literally every other game in creation right now needs the lift, right? And you know, you would think that Star Trek doesn't, but it does. And like, but even the streamers who are playing other games and like the indie games and the itch.io games and all the up and coming games, like the fact that there are streamers out there who are willing to take the time to learn a new game system and not just play it, but also play it and share it with people. That is like the whole, like you said that Star Trek is a family to some extent, and then like there's a whole portion of the RPG industry that's got that kind of like very familial kind of feel, like we're all what's the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats, and so we're all kind of supporting each other and we're all moving forward together. But so in specific for Star Trek, then like I'm just grateful for all of you and the stuff that you're doing, and the fact that you came onto our show to share your experience. And then maybe somebody will watch what you're saying and say, "Oh, I'm inspired. I want to go tell some stories too," and use Star Trek as that venue, whether it's Star Trek Adventures or another game, whatever. But so my gratitude is to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Wow.
And then of course to the fans too, like the fans who are maybe either don't have the technical capabilities or too shy or just don't want to share their stories online. Perfectly fine. You don't have, there's no expectation here. But the fans, always appreciative of the fans for playing the game for so long, for being in the franchise for so long. Grateful for you every day, because obviously be doing this and I'd be finding some other creative itch to scratch, but grateful that the fans are here and that the fans are still strong, and that we can continue to make really cool stuff that you can go play with and do amazing things with. Because like seriously, it's not lip service for me to say that I'm inspired by all of you every day. And Michael, I think I've told you, like, I'm super excited that we just released Captain's Log, because that is going to be another way for people to create Star Trek stories and get them out there to share with. Because like I'm a whale reader, like I can't stop reading, and I love Star Trek stories, whether it's novels or short stories. Now like it's almost self-serving to have done that, to do these games, because it's like, oh, now you can go create stories and then I can read them, and it's an endless loop that I'm really excited about. So anyway, thanks fans, really appreciate it. Right. So Michael, with that here, this has been a great session. Thanks, or a great conversation. Thanks everybody, as always.
All right, IDIC.
Yeah, be safe, be well, live long and prosper. We'll talk to you all next time.